Hiking the Appalachian Trail had always been a dream of mine. I had done smaller sections before, weekend trips, overnighters, but this was my first time attempting a solo multi-day trek. I planned for 5 days, mapping out my route through a quieter section of the trail. No major landmarks, no tourist-heavy stops, just me, my gear, and miles of untouched wilderness. I had been looking forward to the solitude. I figured I'd come across the occasional hiker, but for the most part, I'd be alone. That was part of the appeal. For the first 2 days, everything went smoothly. The weather was perfect, the trail was well marked, and I had no trouble finding good camping spots. I followed all the basic precautions, hanging my food to keep bears away, keeping my campfire contained, and staying aware of my surroundings. Then came the third night. I set up camp a little off trail, near a quiet creek. The sound of running water was peaceful, and I felt lucky to have found such a perfect spot. As the sun started setting, I built a fire, cooked dinner, and relaxed by the flames. That's when I noticed something weird. At first, it was just a feeling, that nagging sensation that someone is watching you. I shook it off. I was in the middle of the woods, alone. Of course it was going to feel a little eerie. But then, when I glanced up from the fire, I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the fire's glow. At first I thought it was a tree. My brain refused to register it as a person at first. But the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was someone standing completely still, facing me. I froze, my hands clenched around my mess kit. I forced myself to call out, "Hey, everything okay?" No response. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward them, but the second the beam hit the trees, they were gone. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just gone. I sat there staring into the woods, heart hammering in my chest. Was it a trick of the shadows? Had I imagined it? I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a tired hiker passing through. Maybe they didn't even see me. But I couldn't ignore that uneasy feeling. I kept my fire going longer than usual that night. I kept my knife nearby, too. But eventually exhaustion won out, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I packed up fast and got back on the trail. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get to me. Then, a few miles in, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Footprints, not mine, fresh ones. And they weren't behind me. They were coming from the side of the trail, like someone had been walking parallel to me through the woods. That's when I picked up my pace. I planned to reach the next shelter early, hopefully meet up with some other hikers for safety. And when I finally arrived, I was relieved to see a few people already there. An older couple and 2 guys in their 20s. I didn't care if I sounded paranoid. I told them what had happened. One of the guys, Jake, frowned. "Dude, you're not the first person to say that." The older woman, Margaret, nodded. "We heard something last night too. My husband swore he saw someone standing near the shelter just watching. That night we agreed to keep the fire going and take turns keeping watch." At around 2 a.m., Jake shook me awake. His face was pale. "They're back." I sat up fast, heart pounding. Across the clearing near the tree line, 3 figures stood in the dark. We yelled. We shined our flashlights. They didn't react. Then, in unison, they turned and walked into the woods. We didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sun came up, we packed our gear and hiked out together. When we reached a ranger station later that afternoon, we told them what had happened. The ranger nodded like he had heard it before. You're not the first ones to see them. I pressed him for details. Who are they? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's hard to say. Some people think it's just off-the-grid folks who don't want to be bothered. Others say it's something else. Something else? Margaret asked. The ranger sighed. A few years back, a hiker disappeared in that same area. Never found. Some people think there's a group out there. People who live deep in the woods beyond the trail. Not friendly. We left that day and haven't gone back since. I don't know who they were or why they were watching. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They were waiting. If you've ever hiked the Appalachian Trail, you've probably heard of McAfee Knob, one of the most famous and photographed spots on the trail. It's got this massive rocky overhang with an incredible view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's the kind of place hikers dream about reaching, where they sit on the edge and take in the endless rolling hills beneath them. I had been looking forward to it for months. I was hiking solo but had met a few people along the way. Other thru hikers, casual campers, friendly strangers who all seemed to have the same unspoken respect for the trail. We looked out for each other, shared water and stories, but mostly we each did our own thing. The day I reached McAfee Knob, the weather was perfect. Late afternoon, golden sunlight stretching over the mountains, a slight breeze keeping the bugs away. There were a few hikers there already, some sitting near the edge, others taking pictures. I sat down, pulled out a protein bar, and just soaked it in. Then I noticed something weird. A guy, maybe 50 feet away, was staring at me. Not casually. Not like he was zoning out while enjoying the view. He was staring directly at me. I shifted uncomfortably and glanced away. But every time I looked back, he was still looking. I decided to move. I got up, stretched, and walked a little further down the overlook, pretending to admire the scenery. When I turned back, he was closer, standing in the exact same position. I tried not to freak out. Maybe he was just an awkward dude. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me, just past me. But something about him was off. They looked too clean for someone who had been hiking. His boots didn't have a single scuff on them. His backpack looked like it had just been pulled off a store shelf. And then I realized I never saw him hike up. McAfee Knob isn't just a random road stop. You have to hike up steep terrain for miles to get there, and I had been on the trail for hours. I had passed every hiker coming and going. I never saw him once. Then he smiled. And I mean smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a polite nod. A too wide, too perfect grin. Something in my gut told me to leave. I turned and started heading back toward the trail. A couple of hikers were packing up their gear, and I figured I'd stick near them for a while. Safety in numbers. That's when I heard it. My own voice, coming from behind me. "Hey, where are you going?" I stopped dead. Slowly, I turned back. The man was still standing there, still smiling. But now, he looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same backpack, same face. My breath caught in my throat. One of the other hikers, a woman in her mid-30s, must have seen my reaction. She followed my gaze and froze. "What the hell?" she whispered. I didn't wait to figure it out. I ran. I sprinted down the trail, heart pounding, legs shaking. I could hear footsteps behind me. Heavy, unnatural footsteps, like someone too big was moving too fast. The woman and another hiker were running too. None of us looked back. We didn't stop until we reached the next shelter miles away, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. "What the hell was that?" the woman finally asked. I shook my head. "I don't know." Neither did she. No one else on the trail had seen the man. No one else had heard my voice echoing where it shouldn't have. But when I checked my phone later that night, I found something that made my stomach drop. A photo, a selfie, of me, taken at McAfee Knob. I didn't take it, and I swear to this day, there was something standing behind me. I've been hiking for years. It's one of the few things that makes me feel truly free. No work emails, no city noise, no one to judge me. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the rhythm of my own footsteps on the trail. But after what happened to me on the Appalachian Trail, I don't hike alone anymore. It was supposed to be a simple solo trip. Just a week in the woods, nothing too intense. I had planned my route, packed everything I needed, and set off early one morning. The first few days were peaceful. I passed a few hikers here and there, some friendly, some keeping to themselves. That's how it is on the trail. Everyone does their own thing. Then, on my fourth day, I met them. 3 men, sitting around a fire at a campsite just off the trail. I normally wouldn't have stopped, but one of them called out to me. "Hey there, friend. You out here all alone?" His voice was friendly enough, but something about the way they all looked at me set off a warning in my gut. 3 white guys, all in their late 40s or early 50s, dressed like they had been out here for a while. Dirty boots, faded jackets, unshaven faces. I nodded. "Yeah, just passing through." One of them smiled. Too wide. "Well, why don't you stop for a bit? Got plenty of food." I wasn't interested. Every instinct in my body told me to keep moving. Appreciate it, but I've got to cover some miles before sundown. The first guy, the one who had called out to me, just stared for a second. Then he chuckled. All right. Safe travels now." I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to look back. For the next few hours, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I checked over my shoulder a few times but didn't see anything. I told myself I was overthinking it. Then the sun started setting, and I decided to set up camp near a small stream, just far enough off the trail to stay out of sight. I cooked a quick meal, laid out my sleeping bag, and tried to shake the unease from earlier. Then, just as I was settling in for the night, I heard it. Voices, low, whispering, close. I went still. The voices were coming from behind me, further into the woods. I reached for my knife, keeping my breathing quiet. I could barely make out what they were saying. Shouldn't be here. Wait till he's asleep. Easy to make it look like an accident. My blood turned to ice. I knew exactly who it was. I didn't wait. Moving as quietly as I could, I grabbed my bag and started breaking camp. No light, no noise, just pure survival mode. I didn't even bother packing everything properly. I just ran. I don't know how long I kept moving. Maybe an hour, maybe more. But eventually I found a small ravine and climbed down into it, hiding under the cover of thick brush. I sat there gripping my knife, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound. And then, footsteps, crunching leaves, slow, deliberate. They were looking for me. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped right above the ravine. One of them spoke, voice cold. "He can't have gone far." A long pause, then another voice. "We'll get him in the morning." I stayed in that ravine the whole night, barely moving. Even when the footsteps faded, even when the forest went silent again, I didn't move. At first light, I booked it out of there. No stopping, no looking back. I hiked 20 miles straight until I reached a ranger station. I reported what happened, but the rangers just nodded like they had heard it before. "You're lucky," one of them said. "Some folks out here don't like strangers." Thankfully, I never saw those men again. Emma and I had been planning this trip for months. We weren't professional hikers, but we had done enough weekend treks to feel confident taking on a more remote section of the Appalachian Trail. We wanted to challenge ourselves, not with anything dangerous, just a few days of disconnecting from the world, enjoying nature, and soaking in the solitude. We had mapped out our route carefully, making sure we had everything we needed: plenty of food, emergency supplies, even a small first aid kit. We felt prepared. What we didn't prepare for was what happened on the third day. The afternoon had been brutal. The section of the trail we were on had been mostly uphill, climbing a steep ridge. We were exhausted, but the view at the top was supposed to be spectacular. Our plan was to set up camp there, watch the sunset, and then get a good night's rest before heading back down in the morning. As we got closer to the ridge, the light was starting to change. The sun had begun dipping behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the mountains. It was beautiful, but also a reminder that we didn't have much daylight left. We needed to move fast. I was walking behind Emma when it happened. She had just stepped over a section of loose rock when her foot twisted at a sharp angle. There was a sickening crack, then a scream. She collapsed instantly, clutching her ankle. Her face twisted in pain. "Emma." I dropped my pack and rushed to her side. She was breathing fast, her hands shaking as she reached toward her foot. The moment I saw it, my stomach dropped. Her ankle was already swelling. And worse, it looked wrong. Bent at an angle that ankles definitely weren't supposed to bend. "I think it's broken," she choked out, eyes wide. Okay. Just breathe. We'll figure this out." But inside, I was panicking. We were in a remote section of the trail, miles from any ranger station, and worst of all, we had no cell service. I tried to think logically. First, I helped Emma sit up against a tree. She was pale, her breaths coming out in short gasps. I grabbed the first aid kit from my pack, pulled out the bandages, and wrapped her ankle as best as I could. Every time I touched it, she winced. "I can't walk on this," she said, her voice shaky. I knew she was right. Even with my help, there was no way she was hiking out of here on one foot. I looked around. The sun was dipping lower now, shadows stretching across the trees. We didn't have time. My mind raced with options. I could set up camp here and wait until morning. I could leave her here and try to find help on my own. I could try to carry her, but I knew that wasn't happening for miles. None of those choices felt good. Then the temperature started dropping. The warm glow of the afternoon was gone now, replaced with the first signs of evening cold creeping into the air. Emma shivered and pulled her jacket tighter around herself. "Maybe we should stay put," she muttered. I nodded, but inside I hated the idea. The thought of spending the entire night alone in the middle of the woods with no way to contact help, it made my skin crawl. I set up camp as fast as I could, pitching our tent right on the trail. Normally, I'd never do that, but I wanted us to be visible in case anyone, passed by. I built a fire, boiled water for Emma, and tried to keep the panic out of my voice. "We'll get out of here," I told her, "one way or another." She nodded, but I could tell she was getting worse. Her face was paler than before, her eyes a little unfocused. The shock and pain were wearing her down. That's when I heard footsteps. I sat up straight, every muscle in my body tensing. It was quiet, but definitely there, the unmistakable sound of boots on dirt. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding. "Hello?" Silence. Then a voice, deep and calm. "You guys all right?" I turned the flashlight toward the sound and nearly collapsed with relief. 2 men in uniform were walking toward us. Rangers. I could have cried. Emma must have seen them too because she let out a shaky breath. "Oh my God!" The first ranger, a tall guy with a thick beard, stepped forward, glancing down at Emma. He knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her injury. "Saw your fire from down the trail," he said. "Good thinking." I swallowed hard. "We didn't think anyone would come through here." The second ranger nodded. "We checked this section at night, just in case." Just in case. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't care. I didn't have to spend the night alone in the woods with a broken ankle and no way out. That was all that mattered. They radioed for assistance, and within an hour, more rangers arrived with a stretcher. They carried Emma out while I followed behind, still in disbelief. By the time we reached the ranger station, Emma was exhausted but stable. They stabilized her ankle, gave her pain meds, and assured us that an ambulance was already on the way. I finally let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. One of the rangers handed me a water bottle, then clapped me on the shoulder. "You're lucky." I looked at him. "Why?" He exchanged a glance with his partner. Most people don't know this, but not many rangers check this section of the trail after dark. A weird feeling crawled up my spine. "Then why were you out there?" I asked. The two rangers hesitated. Finally, the bearded one sighed. "We just had a feeling." I wanted to ask more, but the ambulance pulled up and suddenly everything was moving too fast. I never saw those rangers again. I never found out what they meant. But I do know this. If they hadn't come when they did, Emma and I would have spent the night alone in the dark, miles from help. Maybe it was luck, or maybe something led them to us. I've spent most of my life outdoors, camping, hiking, hunting. I know the risks, I know the rules. Respect the wild, stay aware, and never assume you're at the top of the food chain. But the Appalachian Trail taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Because out there, in the middle of nowhere, I came face to face with something that wanted to kill me. I had planned this trip for months, a 2-week solo hike through one of the more remote sections of the trail. I wasn't worried. I had experience, knew how to handle myself, and had every precaution covered. Extra food, first aid, bear spray, even a personal locator beacon in case of an emergency. For the first few days, everything was perfect. The weather was clear, the views were incredible, and I barely saw another soul. Then, on the 5th night, I realized I wasn't alone. I had set up camp in a dense, quiet part of the forest, miles from the nearest road. It was the kind of place where the trees pressed in on all sides. The ground was covered in thick leaves, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind. I cooked dinner, packed up my food bag, and hoisted it into a tree to keep it away from bears. Standard procedure. By the time I climbed into my tent, the fire was just glowing embers, and the night was silent. Then, sometime after midnight, I heard a noise. Something moving in the brush near my tent. I held my breath, listening. A raccoon? A deer? Maybe even a black bear? Then I heard breathing. Deep, heavy, slow. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the soft, quick breaths of a small animal. It wasn't the cautious huffing of a bear sniffing for food. This was something big. Something watching me. I reached for my knife, barely making a sound, and slowly unzipped my sleeping bag. The breathing continued, steady, unhurried, like whatever it was knew I wasn't going anywhere. Then came the growl, low, rumbling, so deep it vibrated through the ground. And that's when I knew. This wasn't a bear. I had heard plenty of bears in my life. Black bears, grizzlies, even a couple of rare Kodiaks. This growl was different. It wasn't a warning. It was a threat. I forced myself to move. Slowly, silently, I reached for my flashlight and my bear spray. If this thing charged, I had seconds to react. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it toward the noise. And there it was, a mountain lion. 20 feet from my tent, crouched low to the ground, muscles coiled like a spring. Its eyes locked onto mine. And that's when I realized this wasn't curiosity. It was hunting me. I did everything wrong. I had read the survival guides. I knew what you were supposed to do. Make yourself look big, stand your ground, speak in a loud, firm voice. But in that moment, pure instinct took over. I bolted. The second I moved, the cougar sprang forward, silent, deadly fast. I barely made it out of my tent before it slammed into the fabric, tearing through where my head had just been. I stumbled backward, falling onto the dirt. The bear spray clutched in my shaking hands. The mountain lion didn't stop. It stalked forward, slow, its tail flicking side to side. This wasn't a scared animal trying to protect itself. This was a predator that had already decided I was its next meal. I forced myself to stand, arms wide, trying to remember the survival tips. "Hey!" I yelled, voice cracking. "Get out of here." Nothing. It just watched me. Then it took another step, and another. I had seconds. I aimed the bear spray and pulled the trigger. The cloud hit it straight in the face. The reaction was instant. The cougar let out a horrible, guttural screech, whipping its head side to side, claws scraping against the dirt as it backed away. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I grabbed my pack, snatched my boots, and ran. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the dark trail. Every second I expected to feel claws sink into my back. But the cougar didn't follow. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I turned and shined my flashlight into the darkness behind me. Nothing. The forest was silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I hiked until dawn, pushing myself until my legs burned. When I finally reached a ranger station, I told them what happened. The ranger, an older guy who had clearly seen his fair share of wild encounters, listened carefully. Then he sighed. "You're lucky," he said. "Cougars don't usually go after people. But when they do, they don't stop." "So what should I have done?" He shook his head. "Exactly what you did. Bear spray probably saved your life." I still dream about those eyes in the dark. And I know that if I had hesitated for even 1 second longer, I wouldn't have made it off that trail. I wasn't even supposed to be out there. I had been having a rough couple of months. Work was draining me. My relationship had recently ended, and I felt like I was on the verge of burning out. I needed to clear my head, and nothing seemed like a better escape than disappearing into the woods for a few days. I wasn't an expert hiker, but I had done my fair share of long treks. I figured a solo trip on the Appalachian Trail would be exactly what I needed. Just a few days, enough time to reset before going back to my life. I had no idea I wouldn't be going back on schedule, because this trip, it nearly killed me. I planned for a 6-day loop through a remote section of the trail. One of those places where you don't see many people, just endless trees and winding paths. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. I was covering good ground, enjoying the silence, and finally feeling some relief from all the stress I had left behind. Then, on the 4th day, I made a mistake. That morning, a thick fog had settled over the trees, making everything look eerie and unfamiliar. I wasn't worried. I had my map, compass, and GPS. I checked my route, packed up camp, and started hiking. A few hours in, I reached a fork in the trail that wasn't on my map. One path looked well-traveled, while the other was narrow and overgrown. My GPS told me to go right, so I did. At first, everything seemed fine. The trail was steep, but that wasn't unusual. I figured it was just an old, less used section of the path. Then suddenly, the ground dropped. A steep ravine blocked my path. There was no way to climb down, no way forward. I sighed, frustrated, and turned back the way I came. But when I looked up the hill I had just walked down, there was no trail. The path I had just walked was gone. Instead, thick trees pressed in on all sides, the undergrowth unbroken. I took a step forward, trying to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all blurred together, twisting into an endless maze. I checked my GPS. No signal. That's when I knew. I was lost. For the next few hours, I tried to stay calm. I walked in the direction I thought was right. Then I walked another way. Everywhere I turned, it was the same. Trees, endless trees, no landmarks, no markers, no sign of the trail. By sunset, I had to accept it. I was completely off course. I set up camp, convincing myself I'd find the trail in the morning. But that night, as I lay in my tent, I realized something else. The woods were silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then, somewhere in the distance, I heard footsteps. I sat up fast, my heart pounding, and then they stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. But the forest stayed dead quiet. I didn't sleep after that. By the 2nd day, my food supply was running low. By the 3rd, I was rationing water. By the 4th, I was starting to panic. I tried everything. Climbing trees to get a better view, marking trees with my knife, even yelling for help. No response, just endless forest swallowing me whole. By the 6th day, I was weak, dehydrated, and exhausted. I had stopped thinking about making it home. I had started wondering if anyone would ever find me. Then, just before sunset, I saw it. A glint of metal in the distance. I stumbled toward it, my legs barely holding me up. When I got closer, my breath caught in my throat. A hiking pole. And next to it, a trail marker. I collapsed. I had been less than a mile from the main trail the entire time. A few hours later, I ran into a group of hikers who helped me back to a ranger station. They told me I was lucky. People get lost out there all the time. Some of them never make it back. I don't know how I got so turned around. But I do know this. The woods don't care why you're there. If they want to keep you, they will. Most hikers on the Appalachian Trail know about trail angels, those kind strangers who go out of their way to help hikers. Sometimes they leave food caches, offer rides into town, or even invite weary travelers into their homes for a hot meal and a place to sleep. But not every trail angel is what they seem, because out there, deep in the woods, stood a cabin, and the man who lived inside it was no angel. For years, no one questioned the cabin. It wasn't marked on any maps, but hikers who had taken the same route would sometimes mention a kind old man who lived out there. He was always alone. He would wave hikers in, offering them warm food, a place to rest. Some people took him up on it. Some said it was the best meal they had in weeks. But others were never seen again. For 10 years, hikers went missing near that stretch of the trail. At first, no one thought much of it. The wilderness is dangerous. People get lost, fall, suffer accidents. But after a while, the disappearances became too frequent. Something was wrong, and the truth might have stayed buried forever, if not for her, the woman who escaped. One cold autumn morning, a woman stumbled into town. She was barefoot, her clothes torn to shreds, her body covered in bruises, and she was screaming. At first, no one knew what to make of her. She was half-starved, shaking, eyes wild with terror. But once she could finally speak, her story horrified the entire town. She told them about the cabin, about the man inside it, and about the years of hell she had endured. She had been his prisoner, held captive in the basement of that cabin for years. She had been a hiker, just like the others. She had made the same mistake, accepted his kindness, eaten his food, trusted him. Then, after her meal, she had felt dizzy. The next thing she remembered, she was waking up in a dark, damp basement, chained to the wall. For years, he had kept her there, starving her, beating her, using her for his own sick pleasure. She was his secret, and she wasn't the only one. Whenever he brought hikers back to the cabin, she could hear them upstairs, laughing, eating, unaware. Then, after they were done with their meal, there would be a struggle, a few screams, then silence. And after that, the sound of shoveling. Night after night, year after year, she knew exactly what was happening. He was burying them, right outside, in his garden. She had lost count of how many people he had killed, and for years, she thought she would be next. But then one night he forgot to lock the basement door. So she ran. She ran barefoot through the woods, bleeding, half-naked, starving, but alive. And she didn't stop until she reached the first signs of civilization. When she told the police, they thought she was delusional, until they went to the cabin. And they saw the bodies. He had been killing hikers for over a decade. Dozens of shallow graves covered his backyard, bodies in different states of decay. He had cooked them food, shared stories, gained their trust. Then he had slaughtered them. And if that woman hadn't escaped, he would have kept going. The cabin was burned down by the town. No one wanted it standing. No one wanted any trace of what had happened there. But even now, some hikers say that if you pass through that area, you might notice something strange. A patch of ground where nothing grows. And if you stand there long enough, you might hear something. The sound of dirt shifting. Like the bodies underneath are still waiting to be found. I had checked the forecast before I left. Clear skies, mild temperatures, No storms expected. It was supposed to be perfect hiking weather. But if I've learned anything from the Appalachian Trail, it's that the mountains don't care about the forecast. Because by the end of that trip, I was fighting for my life against a storm that shouldn't have existed. I was 3 days into a solo hike through a quiet stretch of the AT. Nothing too extreme, just a 5-day trek through dense forest and rolling hills. The plan was to hike during the day, camp each night, and reach a small town on the other side of the range by the 5th afternoon. The first 2 days were peaceful. Too peaceful. The air felt thick, heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. No wind, no rustling leaves, no bird calls. Just me and the distant sound of my boots on the dirt path. Then, on the 3rd day, the wind started. At first, it was a light breeze, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. But by the time I reached the ridge, it had become a howling force, shaking the trees like they were trying to rip themselves from the ground. I pulled out my phone to check the weather again. No service. Weird, but not unheard of in the mountains. I decided to push forward. The sky was still clear, and I figured the wind would settle by nightfall. I was wrong. By late afternoon, the clouds rolled in. Fast. 1 minute, the sky was blue. The next, it was dark gray, swirling like something was boiling inside it. I should have turned back. Instead, I kept going, stupidly convincing myself that I could make it to the next shelter before the storm hit. I never made it. The first crack of thunder sent vibrations through my chest. The sky opened up. The rain wasn't just falling. It was slamming into the earth, turning the dirt into thick, sucking mud. Within minutes, I was soaked to the bone. I reached into my pack for my rain gear, but the wind was so strong that my poncho was ripped out of my hands before I could even put it on. Then, the temperature dropped, fast. It went from humid summer air to bone-chilling cold in minutes. That's when I realized this wasn't normal. Storms don't come out of nowhere like this. And they don't steal warmth this fast. I needed shelter. I started running, slipping through the mud, my heart pounding. But no matter how far I went, the storm only got worse. Lightning slashed across the sky so close I could feel the electricity in the air. Thunder shook the ground so loud it felt like it was inside my skull. And then, the fog rolled in, thick, blinding white. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. Every step felt wrong, like I was going in circles, like the storm had swallowed the trail whole. Panic started creeping in. Where the hell was I? I should have reached a trail marker by now. A shelter, a clearing, something. But there was nothing. Just endless trees, wind screaming through the branches, and the creeping feeling that I was no longer in control. I don't know how long I wandered before I found the rock. It was massive, jutting out of the earth like a natural wall. I didn't think. I just ducked into the small overhang beneath it, pressing myself against the stone. I could barely breathe. My hands were numb, my clothes heavy with rain, my skin burning from the cold. If I didn't get warm soon, I was going to go into shock. I dumped out my pack, my fingers barely working as I fumbled with my emergency blanket. That's when I heard it. A low, distant sound, a voice. My heart leapt. Someone else was out here. I scrambled to my feet, stepping out into the storm. "Hey, over here." No answer. Then another flash of lightning. And in that split second of brightness, I saw it. A silhouette. Not far, standing at the edge of the trees. I felt my throat go dry. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. I don't remember getting back under the rock. I don't remember anything except sitting there, shaking, forcing myself not to look back outside. The storm didn't let up. Not for hours. I don't know how long I was trapped there, curled up against the rock, my heart pounding in my ears. By the time the wind finally died down, I was barely conscious, my body too exhausted, too cold to function. I forced myself to my feet and started moving, praying I was heading in the right direction. Eventually, the fog lifted. The sun rose, and somehow, I made it back to the trail. By the time I reached the nearest ranger station, I was half delirious from exhaustion. The rangers were shocked when I told them about the storm. There was nothing in the forecast, one of them said. No bad weather at all. I just stared at him. Then I asked the question that had been eating at me since I had left that rock. Has anyone else ever gotten caught in a storm like that around here? The rangers exchanged a glance. Then one of them sighed. Every few years, someone comes through telling a story like yours. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Early in January of this year, I accompanied my grandfather down to eastern Tennessee to the small, rural town he grew up in. After Hurricane Helene, my grandfather wanted to see how his childhood home, which is about a 20-minute drive east of the town, had fared during the devastating weather. While on this trip, however, my grandfather shared with me a lot of stories about his childhood, growing up in Appalachia, and a lot of other things. I learned a lot about him that I had simply never known. One story in particular, however, was genuinely scary, and I had trouble sleeping the night after hearing it. I still occasionally have weird nightmares about it. I will recount that story below. In February of 1954, a few weeks before my grandfather turned 12, his family's little farm had been experiencing some attacks on their animals, mainly the chickens. In the weeks before, they had lost 7 or 8 chickens from their flock of 30 or so. They had a small property, an acre or two, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically near a place called Hall Mountain. One night during a fairly heavy snowstorm, my grandfather's family was awoken to the sounds of chickens screaming and flocking around in their coop some 70 or so yards away from the house. My grandfather and his dad, Paul, immediately jumped into their boots and coats and ran outside to confront what they believed would be some coyotes. As they ran outside the back door, my great-grandfather with his rifle and my grandfather with a pellet gun both stopped dead in their tracks as they saw what my grandfather described, the nastiest, most foul-looking human-type creature you could possibly imagine. A light on the barn illuminated the creature, and my grandfather said that it was almost bare naked, save for what looked to be a bear pelt draped around its shoulders, and had a dead chicken in its mouth. Paul snapped out of his shock and fired a few rounds at the creature. He nicked it once in the upper thigh as it ran across a field, initially on 2 legs, before dropping down to all 4s and disappearing into the woods. My grandfather and his father stood there in shock. They made sure the rest of the chickens and the other animals were all right before my grandfather was told to go back inside, check on his mom and sister, and go back to bed. Apparently, Paul stayed outside for a few hours, pacing back and forth on the porch, waiting for that creature to come back. My grandfather said he hardly slept the rest of that night, and when he got up the next morning, he saw his father in the living room on their phone. As he was eating breakfast, his father came into the dining room, whispered something to his wife, and sat at the table. When my grandfather finished eating breakfast, his mother left the room and his father cleared his throat and started talking. I was on the phone with your uncle. He'll be here this afternoon with your cousin. We're going to follow the blood trail that was left behind by whatever creature we saw last night. It went down into the holler on the mountain. My grandfather said. He just shook his head quietly and didn't really speak the rest of the morning. By 12:30, himself, his father, his uncle Peter, and his cousin Samuel were all walking northwest into the woods, following the bloody trail left behind the previous night. My grandfather said it felt like an hour or so must have passed before anyone spoke. His uncle Peter, who was much more of a hunter than Paul, stopped everyone and pointed at something slightly up the trail. The tracks led up to a spot in the snow that was just soaked in blood. My grandfather said it looked like something had just keeled over and died. What really shocked them as they approached it, however, was how it appeared like whatever had laid there had been dragged deeper into the woods. They began following the new trail that had been dragged through the snow and began noticing multiple sets of tracks which were made by bare human feet, alongside the dragged trail. It was at this moment when my grandfather noticed his father switching the safety on his rifle to off. They trekked alongside the trail a little farther until they reached a small, frozen stream. On the other side of the stream, tucked under a massive cliff overhang, was a cave entrance. My grandfather said it was about 20 feet across and maybe 6.5 feet tall at its tallest. The bloody drag marks and the multiple tracks led right across the stream and into the cave. Paul and Peter told the boys to wait behind a rock, and if they didn't shout back that they were okay in 5 minutes, to run back home and call the police. They walked over the river and stood at the cave entrance before shining a light into it and slowly walking in. My grandfather said that about 4 minutes passed before they heard his uncle's voice, but that it seemed like an eternity. They saw his uncle Peter come out, and his father shortly followed. My grandfather said that they were both pale as ghosts, and that they hardly spoke on the long hike back. My grandfather and Samuel begged Paul and Peter to tell them what they saw, but the two men wouldn't budge, and said that they would all talk later. They all returned to my grandfather's house around 3 that afternoon, and his uncle Peter and Samuel immediately got in their truck and left without saying a word. My grandfather and his father walked in through the back door into the kitchen where his mother was waiting anxiously. Paul hugged her and whispered something to her. She nodded and went into a separate room. Paul sat down at a desk in the kitchen and motioned for my grandfather to bring a chair over and sit. My grandfather did so, and this is what Paul told him, apparently verbatim. Your uncle and I went into that cave and we saw people. They aren't people like you, or me, or anyone you know. They're very different. They live deep in the woods and don't leave, hardly ever. They are almost like animals, I suppose. You might call them wild. It seems like they've lived deep in those woods and hollers longer than anyone has ever been here. We saw the person I shot last night. He must have died. His people were giving him a burial. I believe they saw us and they acknowledged us. They didn't seem mad, but I know we aren't welcome back there. Tommy, do not ever go across that creek. Everything over it is theirs, and we will leave them to it. My grandfather said that was the only time his father ever spoke of what he saw in that cave. His father never went back, and neither did he. I know the whole feral people concept is up in the air and most people don't believe it, which I completely understand. Honestly, I don't think I do either. But the way my grandfather spoke about it, the sincerity with which he spoke, and the tone of his voice during certain parts of the story, I fully believe he was being honest. He truly saw his father fatally shoot a feral human, and his father and his uncle truly saw a small feral community living in a cave deep in the Appalachian hills.